Can you see it now?
Great. And you can go the full view.
5.
Thanks.
Is it okay?
Yes,
okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Christoph.
So Amanda, please go ahead. Thank you very much, by the way.
Thank you, and thanks to David for sharing some of those early insights. And thanks to Christoph for agreeing to move my slides, which was entirely due to my own technical inabilities. So thank you, Christoph. So next slide, please. Just as a reminder for anyone that I didn't have the pleasure of engaging with last year in this sort of New Year event with the organization, just a reminder that Equal Measures 2030, as Christoph said, is a partnership and was founded in 2017. It's made up of those organizations on the screen. So some of the big donors that are in the space, including the Gates Foundation, a number of regional networks of women's rights organizations such as Femnet and CLADEM, private sector actors including Tableau Foundation and KPMG, and other nonprofit and civil society actors at the global level. And then you can see in the map at the bottom that we have a number of national partners across, at the moment, 7 countries. And these are all women's rights organizations at the national level who are wanting to use data more effectively within their advocacy. So we sit at an intersection, a nexus of the SDGs, the gender equality, and a commitment to using data better to achieve the SDGs. Next slide, Christoph, please. Thanks. So our main flagship product, which is what I shared a bit about last year, is an index. It's called the SDG Gender Index. It covers 129 countries, so 95% of the girls and women in the world, 14 of the 17 SDGs, across 51 indicators related to gender equality. It's designed to be universal, so to reflect the spirit of the SDGs, and therefore is not just a tool to measure up global south countries or lower income countries, but rather to look at the way in which gender equality is manifesting across all countries, both high income and low income. So it includes issues related to climate change, related to trade, related to taxation, beyond just the sort of more traditional development issues like health or education. Next slide. Christoph? Thanks. So this is the results of the 2019 SDG Gender Index. So you can see there are a number of countries in which we did not have sufficient data, but as I said, 129 are included. Much like most indices with which you'll be familiar, green indicates higher scores, and the closer to red you get indicates lower scores. They're out of 100. And are based on equally weighted indicators, 3 to 5 indicators within each goal, and each goal is equally weighted within the scoring for the aggregate score. Next slide, please. Thanks, Christoph. So this gives you a sense, this image from the index from 2019 gives you a sense of the achievement gap in each of the different goal areas. And not surprisingly, what you see is issues that have had more investment over the past 15 to 20 years, linked sometimes to the Millennium Development Goals or more sort of traditional development issues, tend to have higher scores here. So if you look at things like hunger and nutrition, healthcare, education, water and sanitation, some of those tend to come out quite high in comparison to other issues that are somewhat more quote unquote new within the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of having kind of global norms and global attention focused on them within a development framework. So things related to climate change, related to inequality, especially related to infrastructure, land, all of those sorts of issues come out much more clearly within the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And you can see that those scores, unsurprisingly, are much lower. You also may note here that one of the lower scores is actually SDG 5 itself on gender equality. So of course, as a result of an SDG Gender Index, that's particularly concerning. And because our topic, or my topic today, especially looks at women's leadership, it's worth noting that 2 of the 4 indicators that most directly speak to women's leadership are within that SDG 5 within the index. Next slide, please, Christoph. Thanks. You can see here the 4 indicators within the index that most directly link to women's leadership. I also included one representation one I thought would be of interest to this group, to let you know that that is also in our index as well. So what you can see, I mean, all indicators in this index link to women's leadership in some way. That's relatively well understood, that they may relate to barriers that women may face in achieving their full potential, whether that's thinking about education opportunities, indicators of adult literacy, indicators around legal access to land use and ownership, wage equality. These things, of course, are connected to the ability of women to become leaders within societies. But these ones are sort of representative of the global data availability on women's leadership. So unsurprisingly, that looks at more traditional things like women in parliament. We also pull out information around women in senior government positions or at the ministerial level. Of course, in other places, you'll see women as heads of state and government. That's also available. We felt that 5E here was actually, in many ways, a more nuanced way of considering that kind of senior government representation. And then the next 2 are a bit new, actually, in the way that we have integrated them into an SDG framework related to gender equality and an understanding of leadership, and trying to go beyond that sort of national political representation. So looking at the way in which women are represented on the climate change negotiation discussions and the delegations that countries send. And also look as well at the percentage of seats held by women on a Supreme Court or the highest court. So again, trying to go beyond some of those more traditional national government indicators. And as I said, I threw in here also, we do have an indicator within the index related to women in STEM and research positions in each country. And there are some interesting, surprising findings on that, which I shared last year and happy to share again. Next slide, please, Christoph. Thank you. So I've just put up here some of the key stats around women's leadership. They're not going to be surprising or shocking to anyone. Of course, women are heads of state or government in just 22 countries. Many countries have never had a woman in that position, and that represents 650 million girls and women living in countries that have never had an elected or appointed female head of state or government. And as we know, when it comes to leadership, role models really matter. And so that is an important factor to take into consideration. We also see, of course, that 21% of government ministers globally are women. And again, thinking about that role model importance, 77 million girls and women live in countries that do not have a single female minister within the government at the moment. An interesting fact here, which I'll get into, is when we look at trends research, progress on this issue in terms of senior government representation and ministerial roles for women has actually gotten slower in the past 15 to 20 years. And actually 40 countries are moving backward on this. If you look across, again, if it was sort of 15 to 20 year time frame, so that's not just a single administration that's impacting that, that's over a number of administrations, you're seeing backsliding around this particular indicator. So again, then we look at how this is playing out in national parliaments. Progress on this has increased within the last 15 to 20 years in some regions, but actually only worldwide, only Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Rwanda, South Africa, and Sweden have reached parity in both parliaments and cabinets. So again, thinking about ministers. And regionally, Asia and the Pacific and Middle East and North Africa are furthest behind on this particular indicator around parliamentary representation. And the last one, I think, which is really interesting to think about in the context of COVID-19, the longitudinal research that's been done around women in the peacemaking process showed that unsurprisingly, women are not highly represented and certainly not equally represented at peace negotiation tables, but that when they are involved, an agreement is 35% more likely to last longer and to last at least 15 years. And I think there's some interesting connections maybe to some underexplored research here in relation to COVID-19. You'll have seen all of the headlines that talk about how countries that have a woman head of state or head of government are doing better on certain indicators related to a COVID-19 response. But actually, it would be really interesting to look at this with a sort of proper research framing rather than an anecdotal kind of media hit, the way that we're seeing, and try to understand what are the factors or what are the common denominators amongst those different countries in terms of their COVID-19 responses. How does that respond to male-led countries? Where do we see good performance from some male-led countries? And then, how can we identify what are some key factors for leadership overall that maybe women are more likely to be showing, but that we're also seeing from men? I think it would be a fascinating piece of research, and I look to all of you as researchers to please do this, because I would be fascinated to see the results. Next slide, Christoph, please. I'll go quickly through this because I'm conscious of our time. So I just want to highlight that we did some trends research that we released in March of last year. So this does not reflect COVID-19 impacts. But I just want to flag again, we looked over the last 15 to 20 years at this indicator related to women in senior government positions, and found, unsurprisingly, despite targets to try to reach parity by 2030, at current rates of change, that's the gray line at the bottom there, we are certainly not on track to meet that. You can see 50% parity is at the top of this graph. That in order to reach it, we'd need to go as 2 times faster, so increase our acceleration rate globally, and that's that dotted pink line. But that actually, when you look at the rate of improvement in some of the fastest moving countries, if you think about a country like Rwanda, for example, or actually even Bolivia, Nigeria, Japan, actually, these are all showing more than 10% improvement per year over that last period. If we all matched that rate of change, we would be able to be on that green line and reach parity much, much faster within these particular roles, just by matching the trend of the fastest mover. Next slide, please, Christoph. I'm not going to go into great detail here, given time, but I just want to flag again that there's obviously, as expected, quite a lot of regional variation in the way in which progress is being seen. And I think one, again, sort of underexplored but interesting piece here is that you see both parliamentary representation and senior government representation tracking fairly close to each other within a number of these regions. But for Middle East and North Africa and Asia Pacific, there's more women the women in parliament is actually increasing much faster than the women in ministerial positions. And it'd be fascinating to think about how is that a reflection of gender norms in a country? Why are women more likely to be elected within parliamentary bodies within these countries rather than appointed to senior government positions within a cabinet would again be a really interesting thing to consider and look at elite perspectives of women's leadership versus more grassroots, for example, or electorate, broader constituency-based understanding of women's leadership and the relevance of women in a leadership role at that level. Next slide, please. I'll just flag this to let you know that on our website, which is data.em2030.org, so there we look at the score from the SDG Gender Index against the pace of change on 5 key indicators, one of which I shared with you, which is about women's leadership. And you can see, unsurprisingly, you've got countries that did have high scores on the SDGs, for example, or on the index, like Malaysia, El Salvador, South Korea, but have since moved very, very slowly over the last 15 to 20 years. So they're not achieving that final mile. Whereas you see in the pink, for example, countries that have had high scores on the index and are continuing to reach the final mile on these issues. And you'll be happy to know, I pointed out Belgium's little dot in there, that Belgium is in that quadrant. But that may be an interesting data viz to explore further on our site. Next slide, please, Christoph. Yes, that's just pointing out, go to our site, please. You can explore more. Next one, Christoph, please. Thanks. I'm not going to go into this because, again, we need to wrap up here, which is too bad. But I guess it's just a flag that we could have a whole nother hour just discussing women's leadership in COVID-19. It's no surprise to anyone that women are underrepresented in the decision-making bodies around COVID-19, but overrepresented in some of the sectors most severely affected and really on the kind of front lines, so the health and social sectors. And that actually there continues to be a sort of gender blind response, even in the UN's response package across governments, that they're not looking at what kind of gender related support might be needed or analysis might be needed around stimulus packages. And I would love to talk more about the sort of characteristics that we're seeing from women leaders that seem to be doing better, but conscious of our time. So I guess maybe, Christoph, if we can send these presentations around to those who attend and they can dig into this a bit more, I'd be happy to share that. But maybe I'll close now to let people ask some questions and get a bit of discussion going.
Yes, thank you very much. Very much appreciated, Amanda. Very interesting indeed. Very interesting research. I saw that there were some questions already for David, but most of them have been addressed already. So I would like to want the ones who did ask the questions, whether